I call this one a shock to the system, and it has some references to some intense solar X-class flares that happened when I was writing this, so I'm just going to leave those in. At 9:10 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time Monday, a huge and the largest so far recently X-class solar flare reached a peak, making this the third immense flare in 24 hours. Now, 2 of these 3 flares are large enough to make the top 10 list of this entire solar cycle, which began January 8th of 2008, and it's going to peak sometime in mid-2013. Let me try to put this into perspective. First of all, in my experience, sudden intense solar events trump or are greater sources of change than even eclipses, which is saying something because eclipses are traditionally very powerful. So here in the middle of a triple eclipse time, 3 eclipses in a row, 2 weeks apart, we have also had, so far, 3 X-class solar flares and possibly more coming. The idea is that these intense solar events are instruments of change. Change injected suddenly into our mind stream that we have no choice but to assimilate. I mean, hopefully creatively, but you can be sure these flares will change our life direction in significant ways, even if it takes some time for those changes to be apparent. This is what's called seed change. And it doesn't do us any good to look outward, look outside ourselves for outward signs, because we would miss the point. Strong solar change is always an inward, as inward as we are ourselves inward. It controls that. And as I keep pointing out, with solar change, it's we, ourselves, we're changing. And it's very, very hard to observe if we are what is changing. It's hard to observe that and also change. And that's the case here. So we kind of have to write it out. And we tend to lose, we lose our general overall awareness at these times quite easily, because we're kind of rocked or knocked to sleep by the shock waves of solar change. An influx of change, even intense change, is a natural thing, but by definition, it's interruptive of our status quo. And once again, this brings the idea of the self, each of our selves, into focus. And I hate to always beat on the self, but as far as interpreting or assimilating these intense solar changes, the bottleneck always comes down to the effects of change on ourself, because the self always ends up being or trying to be the controller, or at least the filter of all change. Now, we know ourselves to some degree. The self does not like to be arbitrarily changed, and solar flares are nothing but pure change that are injected into our time and space. As usual, the self wants to be the arbiter of all change, and with solar flares it's just not possible, except maybe retrospectively. Like a mirror, we tend to only see or witness solar change as it is reflected in alterations or disruptions in ourself. The self apparently always seeks to control this change, to limit or eliminate unwanted change to the way it is, to its status. But with strong solar flares, that's not possible. The result, at times like these, is that some anomalies appear and are evident. They're evident. They're like chinks in our airtight armor of the self that lets light through. And even the minimal awareness that we can sense, or that we can watch the self break down and attempt to reform, is kind of like a stuck record. In other words, let me say that differently. Intense solar change can be overwhelming, causing us to just shut down or lie down and so on. we somehow just have to withstand these inner shocks that outbreak at times of strong solar activity. And it can be, at least for me, a bit of a roller coaster ride. I do my best to share these thoughts with those of you interested, but at the same time, I'm also writing out the changes the same as you are. Considering phrases like self-centered, self-indulgent, self-interested, self-seeking, self-serving, selfish, self-loving, self-absorbed, self-worth, self-determination, and so on. It's an interesting exercise to look up the definition of the self in a dictionary. And here's like one definition of self as a noun. And I quote, "A person's essential being that distinguishes them from others," end quote. And if I dig a little deeper into the etymology of the word self, I find that the root of the word self means to separate, or it means apart, set apart. It's kind of interesting. So the self is separating what distinguishes one from others, or what distinguishes one from the whole, might be a better way of saying it. And this is a Western definition, since the Buddhists would not, they wouldn't credit the self with having any kind of being, as in being existential. And as mentioned in previous blogs, the self is entirely our own creation, at least what it consists of. And like a ventriloquist dummy, we're supposed to be the ventriloquist. We fall into listening to and following our self's direction, what it tells us to do, because it wants to be our boss. So it can be kind of like a Franken-self if we don't see through it, see what's happening. This is why making the self transparent is so important in mind training and in many spiritual disciplines. Somehow we need to see beyond ourself or around ourself to the awareness that we actually are inside of all of this. I mean, that's our true vantage point, the awareness. But I'm not going to belabor this here. I just wanted to make sure that you knew about these 3 huge solar flares, and then that you could incorporate that knowledge into however you're taking these changes. Now, for myself, I always find these times, rare as they are, wonderful. As you know, I'm kind of a liberal persuasion anyway. I'm a liberal, so I tend to welcome change, and I do my best to assimilate it creatively, to use it like the martial art Aikido to better direct my life. And I'd rather be a part of the solution than part of the problem. Anyway, although I do my very best to study these solar changes, I too am swept up in them like all of us. Maintaining awareness at the flood stage of solar influx is not easy, and it requires in me the ability to swim in the stream of the mind, and that's something I'm just learning to do. Yeah, unless you think I'm some kind of expert, I had to take 3 naps yesterday just because I could not manage to do much else because of the mind storms that were going on. I know, color me crazy, but also hang on to your hats.